Well, good afternoon, everyone. If you are on the East Coast of the United States or the Midwest, if you are in the Rocky Mountains, say in Boulder, Colorado, good morning. Hello to people on the Pacific Coast. I'm going the other direction this time. Good, very early morning in Hawaii. Hello, late at night, I suppose it is, in Japan and China, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and greetings in the evening in India, the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and top of the evening to you also in Ireland, and hello to you in Scotland for anyone listening in from there. My guest today, before I do, I'm so excited to have him. I need to introduce my show. This is Fred Plotkin on Fridays on IDAGIO, the place where classical music happens. As you know, IDAGIO is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. Now I could introduce my guest, who is an old friend of mine. He's one of those friends from Planet Opera that we met in an opera context, and that's where our friendship rests. Who, because it is Planet Opera, we don't get to see each other all that often, but we count each other as friends. And I say that just because I want audiences to know that we'll be speaking in a way that will probably sound very collegial and familial. Who is this guy? His name is Andrew Garland. Andy is what I call him, originally from Massachusetts, but he lives in Boulder, Colorado, where he is assistant professor of voice at the University of Colorado Boulder. He is a wonderful baritone, and I want to talk to him about baritoning today. We met, and Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was 2009. And we met because Marilyn Horne, who brings together good people all the time, was leading. Well, I'll just say it was on a ship with 93 passengers. Andy, do you want to explain the story of how we met?
Yes, well, it's like most people meet on a luxury cruise of just 93 passengers for 9 days through the Mediterranean with very enlightening activities along the way. And I think joining us were Nadine Sierra and Sasha Cook
So
and
one
Joshua,
soprano, one mezzo,
yes, Joshua Stewart,
tenor,
tenor. There was Carol Wong and
Jerome Tan,
Jerome, yeah, right,
pianists,
and yeah, and Florence Henderson was there as well, along for the
Florence
ride.
Henderson, the actress, who is a good friend of Marilyn Horne. And Marilyn and I guess you could say, were the faculty in our different ways. And you four singers and young pianists, all already brilliantly gifted and talented, were also very young. And the concept of this cruise, which was not really a cruise, it was like a workshop with food and a piano. And it was on a very small ship, actually. It was not an ocean liner. And we felt the water, we felt the waves, we felt everything. Um, and sailing from one port to the next, Miss Horne would do classes, I would do classes. All four of you sang together. You did solo recitals. Um, I think I led a conversation with Marilyn Horne at a certain point, and people signed up to come on this trip, which in part was tourism for them, but they were all music lovers. But also, funds went to support the Marilyn Horne Foundation, which is intended to provide education for young, talented artists, especially in the art of the recital, the vocal recital. And I remember one day Andy was singing and she and I were sitting there and she was sort of elbowing me like, this is how to do it. And at the end of your song group, she turned to me and she said, I know how to pick them.
Wow. Well, thank you, Ms. Horn.
She picked the four of you, as well as the two pianists. Let's start with Marilyn, then. Would you talk about her role? We know that she's one of the greatest singers ever, but her role as an educator and her role as someone who stimulates interest in and preservation of these beautiful art forms.
Oh my goodness. I mean, I owe directly nearly 50% of my recital career. And if you know my work at all, the bulk of my work is song recitals, which I guess is rare. You know, they tell you in school you'll never make money, you never have a career as a recitalist. And I said, well, sometimes you do. But many of my recital engagements are directly as a result of events organized by the Marilyn Horne Foundation. Uh, so I was very fortunate to audition for and then be added to their roster in 2004. And so the first event for me was a New York debut where I had presented all 21st century American songs. And in the year 2005, you don't have quite the selection to draw from yet. Then your main activity as a singer on that roster is to travel to a community, and your residency there will be a week long, in which you give what some of us call informances. You'll go to a school that was handpicked by the foundation, and I think the two requirements: one was a school that would be receptive to your presentation, but also it is a community that doesn't have an opera company, and there were not Met HD broadcasts at that time, or even a frequent access to classical song concerts, I guess. But it's a place that has the facilities and the infrastructure to present. So I think the first place we went to was Hammond, Louisiana. And that was in early October of 2005. So you fly into New Orleans to get to Hammond, which is just north of New Orleans. And part of my residency was at Southeastern Louisiana University. So you might imagine, there were a whole lot of displaced students from Hurricane Katrina, and displaced persons. So that was a, what's the word for it? That was a special experience, providing song for people who really needed it at the time. And I think that illustrated to me more clearly than any other time, with maybe one exception I'll tell you about, why do I sing, and why do I work on my singing, and why do I perform? It's when you see you're giving the audience something that maybe they didn't know they needed, but boy, did they need it.
I want to stick with the thread you began, but we are going to go back and talk about our cruise
yes,
because it was quite interesting, that trip, as a trip, apart from the musical aspects, which were wonderful, and the fact that we live with our audience, but we're going to get to that in a moment. I, a few months ago, had the honor of, by Zoom from New York City, teaching one of your classes in Boulder, and met your students and gave them a lot of assignments ahead of time. I don't know whether they were used to having so many assignments ahead of time as voice students that did not involve memorizing a song, but it was a fascinating experience in getting to know the students. And I'll tell you, as your friend, getting to know you in a different way, because they, in effect, were all extensions of your tutelage, whether it's the nuts and bolts of singing or the development of the person and the artistic person. One of the many things that I really like about you is that you live your life as you live your music, if that makes sense. And when you sing a song or play a role in an opera, when I've seen you be in an opera, I see it as an extension of the Andy I know. Now, I know many, many, many people who sing opera and recital, and not all of them bring the deepest part of themselves to what they do. Some do. Joyce DiDonato does, for example, and you do. And there are a few people who really do, where it's not that they're playing Joyce or they're playing Andy, but they dig very deep into themselves and connect to the material. Were you taught that, or is that just who you are?
Ah, that's an excellent question. First, I want to thank you for coming to Boulder uh, remotely
Yeah.
and teaching your opera singers in media and social media class. That was a big hit with all of our 100 plus voice students. And it was, and I heard time and time again, that was the stuff that they wish they taught you in school. And so we're thankful for you to, um, for your time in that. But your question, was I taught how to or how to act, or as you say, bring your own person into a character, be it a song or an operatic role? Is that your question?
Well, in other words, I think that if I didn't know you personally and I saw you perform, I would find a lot more meaning and resonance in the characters I've seen you play, or the songs, especially, that I've heard you sing, than other people who may have an intellectual understanding of what they're singing about or acting about, but don't necessarily, I'm going to use the right word, incarnate, bring to flesh, bring to themselves. And it doesn't mean that you're acting out some of your personal issues when you sing a song on a particular topic, but there's a very deep connection to the text, and there's a very deep connection to the music, which of course is what a composer writes when he or she is setting words to music and expressing emotions. It's the music that the composer creates that exponentially brings out what the words mean.
Hmm. Hmm. I think I could cite many events in my musical development. I mean, going back to early childhood, that I think I could attribute to that. Um, I so where to start? I know. Um, well, I think we could agree on a few things. Is that hard work is more important than innate talent, whatever that is. But I think what many of us call talent is the fortune to have developed the right things at the right time. Um, and so I can't remember his name. There's a lecturer, a music history lecturer, who had some really good audio. Long, long before there was Coursera, he had cassette tapes of music history lectures. Um, I think his last name is Grunberg. But anyways, the point he makes here is that all children around the age of 5 are opera composers.
Mm.
They sing the action of their lives out loud. And then what happens is some of us stop doing that, and then some of us never stop. And so I think any one of us, no matter how, say, personal you find them as a performer, are connecting to that, and that's a wonderful thing. And if you lose touch with that, hopefully you find a way to reconnect with that. And so, by this way or the other, I've reconnected with that. I can think of. I've got one good example. I'll give you. Um, and so reconnecting, another way is I say giving yourself permission. A big phrase with acting teachers is honoring your impulses. By the time you get onto the stage, if you have an idea to do something, you don't edit it, suppress it. You're prepared with the notes and how to sing the notes and enunciate the words and so forth. And so that's hopefully not at the front of your mind. And so if an idea comes to you, and of course you've rehearsed with the pianist or the orchestra, know the phrasing and the tempo changes that you want, those are all understood. But even within that, you'll have an impulse to do something. and you honor that. So I think that's part of the training, is giving yourself permission. And someone in a very distinct moment who gave me permission to do that was Jake Heggie, the opera
Composer.
composer.
Yeah.
And he's a theater animal. And one of this, I'm sure you've talked with him here or there, you know, he's a sweet man and very encouraging. And he is constantly doing what he can to bring up the next generation of artists, singers, pianists, composers. He's so encouraging. I don't know. Have you had him on Fridays, on Fred Plotkin on
No, but he
Fridays?
and I were on a ship in Scandinavia.
Oh, wonderful! Even better. But I was preparing
With
his.
Frederica von Stade.
Oh! It's almost too much. Anyway, I was preparing his song cycle. The Moon is a Mirror, and it's his favorite poet is Vachel Lindsay. And in these 5 songs, you assume different characters singing to or about the moon. A famous example we often allude to in a song is Erlkönig, Schubert's song about the Earl King. And in that, you have to depict the narrator and the father and the child and the king of the elves. So those are 4
guy.
voices. Yeah. Right, the bad guy. But there are 4, those are 4 distinct voices and characters you must assume. And I love doing that song. And the only reason I don't do it more is because it's very painful for the pianist, and I respect my pianists, and if they don't want to do that, I don't ask them. But anyways, here's Jake Heggie's song cycle. You have to be, let me see if I get this right, a monk, a miner who is stranded in the desert, a horse, an actual horse, a forester, and a snowman. So those are 5 diverse characters. And I prepared the notes, and I came to his. I was an apprentice at Merilla, so it was very easy. In San Francisco, right? That's the summer program for opera apprentices at the San Francisco Opera. Which, by the way, one of my colleagues said that's one of the few things in life that's all it's cracked up to be. It is a great training program, and I was lucky to do that twice. But here I am in San Francisco. It's easy for me to get to Jake's house, and so I prepared the notes and sang them together. And in the end, he says, "That's good, Andy." But I'm going to be inaccurately paraphrasing what he said, but he essentially said, "You're not acting at all. There's not very much drama in this." And I thought, that's funny. I thought I was infusing it with a lot of character and so forth. So I went home and I did something in the space of a week and a half or so, and came back, and he said, "That's it." He also said at the very end of the last Snowman song, you might imagine that is a very upbeat closer of a cycle. The snowman is not downtrodden. He's very happy to be a snowman and communing with the moon. It's not in the music, but there is a little cadence of 2 notes, ba-ba, at the end. And he said, "I did not tell you this, but you can sing ha-ha on those last 2 notes." And I think that right there, adding notes that the composer did not write, and you can't do that with every composer, by the way, let me say that, but it gave me permission to go as far as I needed to be to still respect the piece, but also bring out what it's saying. And from that point on, I think I made this, and that happened to be right when I finished my last year of formal school. So I was no longer, that helped me make that transition from student to professional. No longer am I gonna have to do whatever the coach tells me to? Am I gonna have to do whatever the teacher tells me to, and nothing else? I now, of course, will seek out the input from coaches and teachers, and I still am. I still take lessons, and I still need coachings. Uh, but I will work with a coach who works with me in a little more, more collegial manner, and I will take what other input and try it out for myself and see that it works.
Um, you've touched on so many things that I intended to talk to you about in separate pieces, and I sort of want to keep the thread. It's important. But so we're going to file away for later working with living composers, because that's something I want to talk to you about at length. But what I think I want to do now is, when I was preparing your students to teach them and had them write essays for me, um, I had them write two. One of them was something that they would use for broadcasting or promotion, but the other was a much more personal essay. And I gave them very few guidelines because I did not want to dictate what they would say. I was interested too to see the quality of their writing, because not every singer and musician is a good writer. You don't have to be. But I wanted to see how they communicated when they did not have the vehicle of music and text. And that was not to judge them or grade them, but really to learn. And many of them revealed a great deal of pain, of life troubles, of challenges, and so on, that I never brought up in our class, as you know, but were very notable to me, because I would ask myself, how could this young person who's 21 or 23 do certain roles or approach certain music when they may not have had life experience? But the corollary was, if you have suffered great emotional pain or occasionally physical pain, or traumas in life, such as separation from family and all kinds of things that I read about among your students, and they're not different in that way from elsewhere. Um, when people talk about Maria Callas, they always say, you can feel her pain. And my answer is no. She understood the music and the words, and she felt that pain, but she was not expressing her pain. But what people often connect to with Callas, who they never heard, obviously, is this communication of pain and suffering, or emotional trauma, or turbulence. What I meant when I was describing you and Joyce DiDonato, and I never made that pairing before, but it is, I love her and I love you, and there's a very similar spirit about both of you, is the ability to pull out of yourself without revealing yourself, I think, is the way that I would say it. Does that ring a bell?
Yes, there's another great way. Let's see what you think of this. I did my graduate studies at the Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music, or CCM for short. And since I did a master's and an artist diploma degree. That's a postgraduate certificate where you focus on the craft of performing. It's not a heavily academic program, but there you have access to some of, in my estimation, some of the best acting teaching you can get anywhere. And in my 2 years of the first year, the acting teacher I had was Dion Kvapel, and she studied directly with Sanford Meisner. The Meisner
Columbia
technique,
University, New York.
yes,
Yeah.
and it's briefly, the Meisner technique involves a lot of what you might call method acting. By comparison, that second year I studied with a woman named Kay Jenny Jones. And oh, of course, if you've been to Cincinnati, you know who that is.
I've
She's
taught at
also
CCM. Yeah.
wait, did you say you taught at
I
CCM?
have taught there. I'm not on faculty, but I've been a
Ah,
guest visiting teacher.
well, they were so lucky to have you. But anyways, in the same year, I had stage combat with her 3 days a week, and then acting 2 days a week. And that I took that class alongside the junior theater majors. These who are folks who are going into film, television, and plays.
Mhm.
Um, uh, and that class was the Chekhov method, which compared to Meisner is a very sort of mechanical and studied, practiced method. It results in some very genuine acting, but it's just the approach, you might say, is more outside in than inside out. And anyways, having the two of those at your disposal, you might
In other
imagine, is a
words,
rich.
one more Olivier, and I'm not making a joke here, one more Olivier and the other more Brando.
Absolutely, that's a great way
Yeah.
to put it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the moment I'm remembering is after I graduated and I came back to just observe a class or just sit in. But she described to her students there was a moment in the class where a couple of students could get just a minute to share their recent experience. Like they had just closed a play and they wanted to reflect on it. And one student, he had had a breakthrough in making himself vulnerable on stage, but still being in control, remembering your lines, hitting your marks, remembering your entrances, etc., etc. Because speaking dialogue, you have to speak the exact words that were written,
As written, yeah.
but it still has to be like you're making them up on the spot. And anyways, and so okay, Jenny describes it as this: a professional actor can come out on stage, open up their chest and say, "This is me," and then close it up and go home, and then
Mhm.
they're back to their normal, stable self.
But a professional actor, just brief background, I began in the theater, migrated to opera as a teenager because I found it theatrically more interesting. I studied with famous baritones. I would have been a baritone had I done that, but I was more drawn to production and the theatrical side for the simple reason that theater, I was a child actor, I didn't like the repetition, even though I knew I was doing it differently every night for a different audience. Opera and song, had I done that, would be different because it's the thrill of making the music every night. But I became much more interested in bringing out the best in others, so to speak, to the degree that I'm trained to do that. So all of my study is about helping singers and so on do more interesting, more complex work. But with that came a lot of production and direction. And the two baritones I studied with were both great actors, Herman Pry and then Tito Gobi. And so, not necessarily with the most beautiful voices among the baritone voices, but complete artists, wonderful interpreters, and so on. And both of them had very different approaches, not because one was German and one was Italian, but Herman Pry was very focused on text in song and music in opera performances. So um, if he was doing Figaro, or if he was doing the Count in Le Nozze di Figaro, or something, in other words, the Figaro from Barbara of Seville and the Count, or if he was doing Dr. Malatesta, all these Italian roles that he did beautifully, it was the music that was the launching pad to him. Whereas in song, it was the text. So even if he did a German opera, it was the music that launched him. Tito Gobi was more about the Chekhov method, the way you described it, from the outside in, and that he would look at all the externals, the physicality of the character, the ideas, emotions of the character, and then contemporaneously study music and text, not one, then the other.
Hmm.
And that to me was so interesting because most everyone I know in this business starts either with the music or with the text. But he would merge them, having already given a lot of external consideration to the character. He was a very good caricaturist, as in drawing, and he would draw ideas for makeup and what he called the teggiamento, posture, posing, to get the physicality of the character, even before he really got into the music and the text. And it was only after that was his way in. And I raise this because each of you who do what you do have a different approach, even if you've all been taught by the same people. And I find that fascinating. And my next question for you regards how you teach, because you're still a young man, but you're already an accomplished teacher. And that doesn't just happen. There are certain opera singers and leader singers who become great teachers, but usually they're older than you are. And because I got to know your students, I could see the extension of you in different ways. So the question is the following: for all of your students, what do you insist upon and where do you flex in terms of, well, if you feel this or you want to do that, you can do that and you can do this, and different for each student, but there must be certain things I would imagine that are required, and this is the work that has to be done before I'll flex on things.
Oh, well, the first thing I insist upon is legato. Please. No matter what you're singing, I mean, unless it's, specific, unless the composer asks you to sing non-legato, then they write that in the music. But the default
Define that,
setting,
please.
yes,
Please
of
define
course,
legato.
legato. Yeah, if you take nothing else away from this today, ladies and gentlemen, please sing legato and insist that your singers sing legato. I mean, even if you're an audience member, like look for legato singing. Legato in Italian, I believe it means tied together or
Linked.
connected.
Yeah.
So one note needs to be connected to the next. That's maybe the most important, well, certainly the most important artistic value. Uh, and we must never lose sight of that in our training, dramatic or technical. Uh, so I will never ever flex on that unless there's a moment in the music that's supposed to be not that way, and those moments are fewer than you might think, and the composer expressly writes that. Um, then so an example of where would I be flexible? Uh, in most composers, you have a say as to bending the tempo a bit. Very little music, at least that I do, is meant to be purely metronomic. Um, Now, if you're a pianist instrumentalist, you must practice, or most teachers insist on practicing with a metronome, but that's practicing. That is not to make its way into the finished product. Which, by the way, I'll just say very briefly, during all the teaching that we've had to do remotely because of COVID, there has been a lot of students singing with pre-recorded piano tracks,
Mm.
and that has not been great, especially if they're using computer-generated tracks, which are metronomical, and you can hear after just 3 notes if something was recorded by a human or if it was done by a computer. Um, given that the student has learned the correct notes and rhythms, they're free. Once we're both agreed that they know those, they are free to play with the timing of that. And some composers, want more than that. Much Stravinsky doesn't ask for very much rubato.
Yes, I was going to get to the word rubato, but you said it. So
Right.
define
So
it and explain
rubato,
your view. Yeah.
you could look at it this way: you're robbing some duration of this note to give to this note, if you want to take the literal sense of the word. Um, I would love to sing an example, and I'm blanking on one. If one occurs to me in the next minute, I'll use it. Well, I could. Maybe one of the most popular songs that I do is a folk song setting by Stephen Mark Cohn. And I want to talk a little, if we don't get back to him, let me just say I consider his folk song settings, of which there are 15, to be standard repertoire, only completed in the last 20 years, but it's as widely performed now and as taught in literature classes and assigned to students of all ages as standard repertoire. And song one of book one is a setting of a sea shanty 10,000 miles away. Everybody just loves that tune. I will do a program of some very dynamic, moving, difficult stuff. And an audience will say, you know what I really like, what I really remember, 10,000 miles away. I say, good, I'm glad you like it. But anyways, can I show you how how it opens? Okay.
Please.
So I'll try and sing a kind of blank canvas version of the text. Sing I for a brave and a gallant bark, for a stiff and a rattling breeze. So that had very little rubato. The note lengths are equal to each other. Now, if I were to adjust that for whatever reason, I'll give an example of rubato. Sing I for a brave and a gallant bark, for a stiff and a rattling breeze. And if you heard the accompaniment going, I'd still be on the same page, so to speak, with the accompaniment. We're still in the same point in the music. We're still in tempo. I've just taken a little value from this note and given it to this one. Why
would you do that?
Oh, yeah. Why would I do that, you ask? Some big reasons are the cadence of the language. In no language are all syllables emphasized exactly the same way. And I gotta say, that's a pet peeve I hear. I'll hear singers of all levels doing that at one time or another where it's not called for. And I say, please sing. And that's the phrase my students are already tired of hearing this. And I say, if you're tired of hearing this, then please do it. Sing with the cadence of the language. I'll show you very briefly if I don't follow the cadence of the language and give equal dynamic and linguistic emphasis. Sing I for a brave and a gallant bark, for a stiff and a rattling breeze. Now, those are all the correct pitches, the correct note values, the correct phonemes. My diction was correct, and it was clear you could understand the words. But man, I don't want to listen to that.
Mm-hmm.
You see? So, and that's another thing about diction, right? There are sort of three levels to it. There's pronunciation. There's choosing the right, is it, ah or eh? Which sound is it? There's enunciation. There's pronouncing them exactly correctly. But then expression. That's the third component of diction that, please, you must have, no matter what it is you're singing.
I'm going off in a direction, something I've been meaning to ask you for about 10 years, but it relates to this. I'm guessing that your background, because you grew up in Massachusetts, is probably English, Scots, Irish, at least in part.
How could you tell?
Just a guess. And because I've said to you many years ago, and I still believe this, that you would be ideal in films and some of these British-made programs that require a guy with fair skin and red hair who sings the way you just sang, with attention to lyric and so on. Your usage in language, as English especially, as a singer, is outstanding. And I hear many people do it, including many native speakers who don't sing with care in their native language, in English in this case, Whereas there are sometimes foreign-born singers, Regine Crispin, Jonas Kaufmann, who really have a very strong feeling for the languages they're singing in that are not their own. And it doesn't mean you don't notice an accent, but you notice, I've said this before in other programs, so listeners forgive me, but Regine Crispin taught me one of the most important things I've ever learned. Il faut vivre la langue. You have to live the language, which means not just knowing the language fluently, but living its cadences and living its subtleties, which requires a great deal of study and feeling. And you are one of the singers in English, and Marilyn Horne is another, who really make our language beautiful and meaningful, or dramatic or sentimental, or whatever emotions and sensations can attach to it. You do, which is part of the pleasure of listening to you perform. And that's something I spotted the first time I heard you back in 2009, when you were still wearing a Boston Red Sox baseball cap and had not found your way yet. Listeners, Andy and I'm a Yankee fan, and we're friends, but that's the one thing we diverge on. And but the thing is, seriously, your language connection, I think that's the word I want to use, not language usage, which is what a word we use to teach with, but your connection to language in English, and not only, but especially English, is quite notable. So therefore, my question is, when you are teaching these young people, many of whom were American born, there was one Canadian, and there was a Chinese and a couple of people from elsewhere. What do you do to really turn them on to their own language when they speak it frankly, and not just your students, but people everywhere, carelessly?
What do I do to
When you're teaching them singing and usage of language in their performances, how do you unlock all the things that I know are your artistic values? How do you unlock it in them?
well, again, provided that they're prepared with the piece, that they're confident in their notes and rhythms, but also in their diction. It's funny, everyone has to take English diction class, and most students say that's the hardest of the four. The four staple diction classes that most conservatories offer are English, French, Italian, and German. Hopefully, you can get training in other languages, and please sing in other languages. Right up at the front, Spanish, please.
Mm-hmm.
And I can teach someone Castilian and Central American, Mexican, South American Spanish diction, and that just comes a part of their lesson. They're doing a song by Guastavino or Montalbán or Obrador, so I can work the diction into their class. There just isn't time in a curriculum to take a semester class in all these languages. But that is to say, when they know how they're going to pronounce each word, and that's not a question anymore, and it is a conscious decision you have to make, and you have to spend a little time on it. I mean, you're not going to pronounce Purcell the same way you pronounce a spiritual arranged by Moses Hogan or H.T. Burleigh. That's different English.
Mm-hmm.
So given that you're prepared with your notes, rhythms, pitches, and diction, it's mostly a unlocking or giving permission to be expressive in that general term. I do it mostly by way of asking questions, and there are the basic questions. Who are you? Your character. Who is your character? What do they want, and how are they going to get it? And that applies to any song anywhere, and there are no wrong answers. And you don't need to be completely beholden to whatever source material there is. You can fill that in with what you know as a person. If you understand that person's pain, you don't necessarily have to have, um, lost a child to sing about losing a child, etc., etc. So it's asking questions. And to that end, I sometimes will borrow, uh, while I was at Cincinnati, both at Cincinnati Opera and at the school, the conservatory, and then later in the professional world with the stage director and teacher Nick Muni,
Sure.
and
Who was in
he,
Tulsa for many years and did one of the best Traviata productions I've ever seen.
oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
But he taught our opera characterization class. That's required for the master's students, not those artist diploma, post-professional performance focused degrees. That's required for all master's voice students at Cincinnati. So characterization is much like that initial stage you referred to that Tito Golbi would study. How does this person behave, look, move? Those sort of characteristics. But he compiled a very, I want to say, 8 or 9 page character sleuthing worksheet with about 100 questions you ask of your character. With some advanced students who are doing a complex, say a full-length lead role in an opera, I'll say, you got to answer all these questions. But if we're talking about a character in a 3-minute song, we might distill that down to maybe 5 questions. And even then, you'd ask, who is this person? What do they want, and how are they going to get it? You fill in those blanks, and well, I guess then I have to create an atmosphere, an inviting atmosphere where they feel safe and free to try out these ideas. And I set up my room in such a way. I speak in such a manner.
How do you set up your room?
I've people are going to call shenanigans on me, but I say it's not extremely neat and organized, but neither is it all. And I say, one, that's just the way I am. If you know what I am, I'm not super organized, but it's clean. You better believe I dust in there because we have to sing, and so forth. But everything isn't just so that for me, that's who I am, for better or for worse. But I think part of that, and I'm not just blowing smoke here. I mean, when you come in, if you're not feeling like you're going to mess something up, or you're expected to be rigid and obedient and just so. And I do have a combination of my own sort of concert posters, but also art. And I'm going to start adding my children's artwork, by the way, which now I'm biased, is quite good. I'll send you some of that. But anyways, so that's the room setup. I've got a couch too, and if you need to discuss something, if we need to talk for more than 5 minutes about an important matter, sit on the couch. And then
Not lie on the couch and you're Dr. Freud, but sit on the couch.
Right.
Yeah.
No,
And
exactly.
I'm not being jokey here, because there is the quote psychological element that enters this working situation, as you well know, and so do I. And that's the question after the question I'm about to ask you. So let's hold that. I was very interested in when you said how I set up my room, because when I teach and set up my room, my ideas are very different from yours. And that's interesting because the way we create the space creates our teaching. And what I do very specifically, and I do this, there's another university in Ohio where I teach, and what I've insisted with the teacher, the professor there, is that she set it up so that it's almost a semicircle, almost like I'm on the proscenium and it's a theater in the round. So it doesn't fully surround me or whoever is performing, but everybody has an equal view of me. Everybody is equidistant. But because someone's at a side and someone's in the middle, their perspective is different. And I don't assign seats. I say to them, sit where you want. And I'm always interested to see who sits where and then what they have to say vis-a-vis where they're seated. Because sometimes the ones in the middle are a little more audacious about expressing their opinions, whereas the ones on the side are more skeptical, but tend to have the more interesting comments. And when someone is performing or I'm having them sing, I allow them to either perform from their seat or spot or come and stand with me and give them the choice so that if they want to sing to their colleagues, their classmates, they can, or if they feel more comfortable in their spot where they were, that's fine. Um, I will not stand when one of them is performing. I will move completely to the side so people don't see my reactions. It's not about me, it's about the student. Um, but then once they finish, I come back. But the reason for this is I don't want a classroom setting where people see the backs of other people's heads. That's what's very important. It's kind of like they all have the same equal seat and equal access. And I find that when I'm allowed to do that, it's a better class than if I go in a classroom where there are anchored seats and they're sitting all the way up. The people in the back will draw or sketch or look on their computers or their phones and whatever, even though I don't allow that. And the quality of the class is not as good. So I never really heard someone talk about how he sets up his room.
My favorite classes, academic classes in high school, were set up that way. We deliberately set up our own desk in a semicircle. And we teach studio class. We rotate rooms, so the class every week is in a different room. And whenever I can't, sometimes it's in the theater, and the seats are fixed.
Right.
But we have a good mix, and I think this sort of sums up Boulder. Actually, a good mix of an informal atmosphere with an ethical regard to high standards. So
Mm-hmm.
when we're in the theater, we're that way. If you're not performing, you're wearing your street clothes, you're sitting next to your friend, but you're paying complete attention to your classmate who's singing. And yes, the same thing. I move out of the scene for when the student's performing, so it's just them free to perform.
So since you said Boulder, I'll get to that, and then I'll get to the question that I'm holding to ask you that we brought up before. Um, 1987, I think it was. You were probably a toddler. I was working at the
I
Santa
was
Fe
10,
Opera.
but
Okay. At the Santa Fe Opera. I was a young man, but I was at the Santa Fe Opera. And one of the productions was Orfeo ed Euridice with Marilyn Horne and Benita Valente. I know. So I got to be in rehearsals and all that. And, that was a massive education for me. And I knew Marilyn already, which is part of why I was out there. But I remember that both she and Benita remarked to me and to all of us, because there was an apprentice program. I was beyond apprentice, but I would sit in with the apprentice classes. And about the fact that the elevation, 7,000 feet, I don't know what that is in meters, but 2,500, 2,300, was very high. And breathing was something entirely different. This is an outdoor theater. So Boulder, Colorado, I don't know the elevation, but it's high as well. It may not be as high as Santa Fe, but Colorado is certainly, I know the sports team is in Mile High Stadium in Denver. So how do you, as a man who grew up by the Atlantic Ocean with that moist air and all of that, what's it like to sing and work at this elevation?
I'm sorry, I'm going to remember a very important answer to your previous question before I forget, but I will tell you exactly what you want to know. More important than anything I said in terms of giving the student permission and unlocking, I learned this from Stephen Wadsworth, a
Director.
director and a very thorough acting teacher. Very lucky to have worked with him. In my graduate and undergraduate years, I would have some teacher or another, sometimes in a public master class, ask me a very private question in order to get me to connect with the text. And I did not want to be asked, much less answer that question out loud. And but it was a different time. He just did what the teacher said. So, but Wadsworth's variation on that is very simple. Just ask whatever. It could be the most intimate thought that you have. Just think of it. Don't tell me. Problem solved. And there you have where you can be completely intimate, but still not vulnerable to the point of compromising. You know, you're still in control and you've got your technique and so forth. So there you
So
have
Andy,
it.
we're on the same page, because that was my next question, but I was going to take it in a different direction.
Very
So
good.
talk about the thin air, the elevation of the
Yes.
oxygen,
So
and then we'll go.
after, it varies person to person, but 2 to 3 days, you're adjusted to the point where you can walk up a flight of stairs and you can sing a long phrase. Some people it might take longer, but if you're there for an opera, you've got a couple weeks before you start performing in public. So it's just time. Drink more water, please. I mean, if you're a singer, if there's anything you've learned, you've got to. You saw me. It was,
Hydrate.
maybe subconsciously you started talking about the air, and I reached for my water. But you acclimate, and then you become acclimated on another level after 3 months or so. And
What about legato? Again, I'm not making a joke here, but when Marilyn Horne, who is, fabulous, and Benita Valente was fabulous, were singing these long lines of Gluck, it was hard in that air in Santa Fe, out of doors, don't forget.
Oh, yes. I mean, one thing you can do is, if necessary, you're first in that adjustment period of 2 to 3 days, you can just take more breaths than you would. In any musical phrase, and there are some composers who insist you sing a certain, very long phrase, but otherwise you have options based on the music and the text. I can breathe here, I can breathe here. By the way, you can breathe without interrupting the thought of a phrase.
Mm-hmm.
You might, I can't think of an example, but it's, I'm in the middle of telling you a sentence, and you can see that I had the thought still in the air, even though I stopped vocalizing for a second.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we tell this is very important to students who come to audition at Boulder. We repeat many, many times, it's okay to take more breaths. You don't get points off of your audition. I heard an interview with Renee Fleming. I think Colorado Public Radio interviewed her because she was, as you know, she's directing the Aspen program now. It's another excellent training program. And Aspen is even higher than Santa Fe. And they asked her, now, we're asking one of the most elite singers that ever existed, but the announcer asked her, how do you handle the altitude? And she said, mind over matter. So I guess that may work for her. And I suppose if you are as mentally tough as she is, then that works for you. For the rest of us mere mortals, you get an extra day to adjust. I think your red blood cells increase, and you get. Now that takes more than 3 days, mind you, but you get conditioned to the point where you can sing as you would. Interesting, though, we have pretty strong voice science here at Boulder as well. And our director of pedagogy cited a study that said it's actually at about 7,000 feet, where the air is so thin that the air that you expel has a different pressure. Your air comes out for, just the basic mechanics. The air comes out of your lungs and passes through your vocal folds, which are stretched very tightly, much like a double reed instrument. Or if you ever take a balloon and pinch the end of the balloon and it makes a whining noise, that's the two ends of the balloon rubbing together, which incidentally, that's what your vocal folds sound like if there's no neck to alter the sound above it.
That's from Tennessee Williams' No Neck Monsters. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, which would be a great opera, by the way.
Oh my, yes.
and you could play brick. How about that?
I'll do it. Sign
Yeah,
me up.
yeah.
Oh my. Uh,
In fact, that would be a great role for you, would be brick.
but the air is so, I'm going to
Yeah.
remember that, and we'll just have to commission it and get it
Mhm.
get it off the ground. But the air is so thin at that point, you have a different pressure, what we call subglottic pressure. The pressure below your vocal folds is different, and that's an adjustment you need to make to. And again, in 2 or 3 days, most people, they just do their regular routine, sing through the repertoire they've been doing. They can condition themselves to that, but it does need to be done. Central City, which is not even an hour from my house, that's even higher.
Yep.
So the folks who live here at Boulder, which is just over a mile high, 5,300 feet, people who live here year round go to Central City and have the same adjustment,
Huh.
the same difficulty.
So since we're really on this, and I know you know your stuff, I've been to Mexico a fair amount, but I've never been to Mexico City, and I've avoided it because, frankly, the elevation is so high and the air pollution is so big. It has a massive population that, in Colorado, where you are, and in Santa Fe, it's not that densely populated, and there's a lot of effort to use clean environmental practices. But what happens in a place where you're singing and it's polluted, but then add the fact that it's polluted at a very high elevation? How does that affect performance?
Well, I'll quote, you interviewed my good friend Mike Mays, who, we had the same teacher at the same time in grad school.
Uh-huh.
And he, until recently, lived just about 20 minutes from here in Lyons,
I know.
Colorado. Uh, but we were both singing at Fort Worth. And Fort Worth, Texas is not particularly polluted. It's certainly not as bad as Houston, which, Houston is great culturally, but it's not good for particulates,
Right.
for the air quality. But there was a forest fire or some kind of large fire that had blown smoke over the whole city. But as you know, Fort Worth is a festival, or became a festival in, I think, 2006, which meaning all three of their productions are happening at rehearsing and going on at the same time. So he's in the cast of Carmen, I'm in the cast of Cenerentola, and someone else is doing Dead Man Walking all the same time. Excuse me. And he just said, nobody's bringing their A game. Meaning, we're all here. I mean, we're not competing, but it's a level playing field. Although I will say it was intimidating and uplifting to sing opposite Isabel Leonard in a Rossini show.
Yeah.
But I think I held my own. But that is just and some people could manage that differently from others. But shoot, what do you do? Before masks were de rigueur, many of us would wear masks in situations. If I'm in a new city and I know there are allergens, I'll just walk around in a mask, and I looked weird, and I got over it pretty quickly. I mean, you're already a singer, you're weird. So, wearing a mask kept you from inhaling too many allergens, pollutants, so
And
forth.
keeping on a Texan theme, since Andy, you and I tend to feed each other's, we have to keep a checklist of the things we still have to talk about. I once worked at Austin Lyric Opera, and Austin is the capital of Texas. It's a city that has grown population-wise massively in recent years. It's a beautiful city. I like it very much. And there's a river. And Lady Bird Johnson, the former First Lady of the United States, was very into planting flowers and beautification. And her husband, Lyndon Johnson, they were from near there. And Austin is planted with all kinds of flowers and trees and so on that create massive amounts of pollen. And because I'm not from there, I was not suffering from it. And I tend to, because I was not allergic to what was in Austin. But local people were gasping for air most of the time. And for the chorus and the orchestra, the production that I was connected to, they were gasping just in rehearsals, including, wind players who would try to blow their clarinet, and they would start heaving and coughing because they just couldn't. And it raises a whole issue that I care about, certainly the environment in general, but As I've managed theaters and have been responsible for the buildings and the decisions, and I have a dear friend who you will meet and become a friend of, who built Bass Hall in Fort Worth and is environmentally focused. And he and I, his name is Paul, talk all the time about the choices that are made and how buildings are constructed, and both for the singers on the stage and for the audiences. But in a COVID era and after, they're having to retrofit older buildings, and there are new discussions about how to build a theater that's environmentally safe, but also breathable and pulmonarily safe, if that's a word. And you live in Colorado, which is often described as the healthiest state in the country. You, by all estimates, you're from Massachusetts, which is a state that historically had pollution, but also ranks among the healthiest in the country in terms of physical fitness and medical care and so on. It was the first state in the country, along with Hawaii, to provide medical care for all citizens before that became a national thing. And so therefore you grew up in places and have worked in places that tend to care about the environment. What happened? I mean, I want you, as someone who's a father and someone who teaches young people, to think about their future in terms of environmentally being able to perform in the arts, but number two, to attend the arts.
Mm. Well, one thing I've got to really think about is how much am I going to travel by air from now on? Because I know statistically, my individual choices are not going to make a difference. But if other people follow my example and we get policy change that it improves the environment, but also a cultural change which can be brought about one person at a time, that could make a difference. And so I think what you're talking about there, a shift to more quality regional performing, where you hear as singers who do not have to travel great distances to come to the audience. I'm surprised. I don't want to say disappointed, but I would have thought that that after we had a time where travel was restricted, that some companies would have thought more about using more local artists. And by the way, not making local artists synonymous with subpar, because you're a local artist somewhere. And we do joke whenever I play somewhere, we say, oh, you're the local artist, or someone who's brilliant but just happens to live here. Michelle DeYoung, she's lives just down the road. She's a local artist, but
Yeah.
of course a world-class singer. My goodness.
She was on this program last summer.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I haven't spoken explicitly about this, but it gets me thinking. I don't suppose you know Ian Howell, who teaches at New England Conservatory, had a great career. There's I've got a long list of people I think you would like to interview, and he's one of them. But he led the charge for integrating technology into COVID teaching, and then afterwards but one point he had made in writing is, he said, I wonder if we're going to see a shift to more regional performances and not have regional be synonymous with subpar. Greta Thunberg's mother is an opera singer.
I know. I love to have her on this program. She's a wonder. Milena Ehrman.
Yeah. And
one of the greatest Purcell singers. She's Swedish, but I heard her sing Purcell in Paris, and she was fabulous. Yeah. But her daughter won't let her travel.
Yeah. And if my daughter had such conviction and information to back up that assertion, I would follow that too. And it's something I really got to think of going forward. Um, so in
Well, I'm
this,
going to pick up the thread a little more on that.
sure, sure.
I, just before the pandemic hit, or just maybe as it was hitting, was thinking about these issues and published an article at WQXR here in New York about, it was around Earth Day too, and so around your birthday. And it was about how we need to environmentally be more conscientious in opera. And that includes industrial hygiene, in other words, the materials used in costumes and scenery and so on, but also this concept of having regional artists, and without that being a negative term. And I proposed a few, and one of them, he would have done it anyway, Tomer Zulin, who's the head of the Atlanta Opera and who was my guest more than a year ago now, created one of the first opera pods of the pandemic, in which he gathered people like Morris Robinson, Russell Thomas, Jennifer Larmore, I think Michael Mays, a number of others, and they were brought to Atlanta or near Atlanta. And once they got through the quarantining period, they were not sick, but just to keep them out of contact, they then could live in a pod as an artistic community and perform in outdoor spaces in Atlanta, and did very successfully. And Michael Mays was thrilled about this stuff. And Tomer hired a wonderful visual artist who created appropriate and environmentally ethical scenery and production materials and filmed them, so that Tomer had this longer view of how to then bring our, quote, regional opera elsewhere. And it is doable. And in Colorado and nearby, I'll link states. I'll say Colorado and New Mexico and Arizona. Let's do three. And Las Vegas. There's Dolores Zajic lives there. And there are plenty of people in those four states. So we're not even talking California or Texas, which are big entities, but just in between them, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, let's add it, Colorado, and Nevada, have an incredible amount of talent there. And you would call it the Rocky Mountain Opera Company. And it could tour. Because, for example, in Italy, in Lombardy, there are 5 towns, not La Scala, not Milan, but Como, Pavia, Brescia, Cremona, and I'm leaving out the 5th, that build productions together and tour them among the cities, using the same singers and the same conductors, the same chorus, the same orchestra. And environmentally it works, and it means that also we're saving money by building a production so that audiences don't have to travel from Boulder to Santa Fe or Phoenix to Las Vegas, because it will come to them. And the Atlanta pod could go in the Southeast, maybe not quite as far as Miami and Orlando that have their companies, but there could be a Florida pod of Sarasota, Orlando, Palm Beach, Miami, that kind of thing. Certainly in the Northeast, we have that. Northeast, we have more dense population, but the Pacific Northwest, that's very doable. And so you as a teacher, Andy, can, if you choose to, instill those values into your students. And now that brings me to the question that we were going to cover before, that it's, to me, as someone who teaches young people about opera, it's the most challenging question. It's the hardest question. It's one of the most important questions once they've gotten past learning how to sing and know music. You were talking about you don't have to tell it, but you have to feel it. Reminded me of a line from Verdi's Ernani: Ogni cor serba un mistero. Every heart harbors a mystery, which means that we don't have to tell everything, but within ourselves, we have to be completely honest. if you know the film Smiles of a Summer Night by Ingmar Bergman, which became the source material for Little Night Music, which you'd be terrific in, by the way, too. The old countess says, and I'm paraphrasing, the only time you have to be completely honest is when you're playing solitaire, which is a wonderful line. But it's sort of the opposite of what we're talking about here. Namely, I just figured out 21 years older than you are. You are teaching people who are 21 years younger than you are. And therefore, each of our generations, our life experiences, our acculturations were different. Our exposure to the way issues of sexuality are addressed were entirely different from my generation to yours to the one you're teaching. But then, because we work on subject matter that's often hundreds of years old, when Lucia di Lammermoor has limited choices because she's in effect being married off to a man she doesn't love so that the family can keep its possessions and not go broke. Number one, it's a horrendous thing, but it happens to have happened in history and unfortunately still today in different places where girls are married off or sold, even in our world, unfortunately. And therefore, the values that we ascribe, when young artists say to me, oh, that's not relevant, that's already a problem. I don't mean the specific issue, but in general, when they say that's not relevant or I don't experience that. And I have to remember, for example, that discussions of gender and sexuality and even pronouns, a he, a she, a they, a them, a whatever, I'm not judging any of that, but the fact that it enters discourse and presentation, if we're teaching a young mezzo soprano to play Cherubino, it's about the fact that she's playing a young boy and she's not gender fluid. At least I don't see the character that way. But I've met young people who say, oh, this character is gender fluid. Well, no, it's actually that the composer and librettist created a role for a mezzo soprano to play a teenage boy for the following reasons. So that, or Octavian. So you have to find your male side, if you want to call it that, or you have to look at young men and learn from them. On the other hand, pre-COVID, pre-AIDS, the physicality in opera and theater, the touching, the kissing, all of that, and also in classes. And I'm not in any way defending anyone who touches inappropriately. I don't mean that at all. But there was a magnificent Irish soprano who became one of the world's great teachers, Veronica Dunn, at the Royal Irish Academy of Music. Did you ever work with her?
No,
She
but
would have
actually,
loved you.
oh well, no,
She would
I've
have had
heard
her hands
much.
all over you.
I've heard much about her.
But that's really the point. She was an amazing teacher, and she taught Irish singing teachers. So there's a whole generation now, too, who teach the Veronica Dunn method. And I had the honor of doing a class with her once as a co-teacher. And the places that she put her hands would just not, she was in her 90s and grew up in a time when the singer, if she wants you to know where you're supposed to feel this and that in terms of your diaphragm, she put her hands there. And I remember that she put her hands rather low down on a very tall redheaded Irish bass who was very young and very polite and in awe of being with Veronica Dunn, Ronnie Dunn. But he was entirely startled the way she touched him. And I'm neither defending nor complaining about that, but it's just that tutelage has changed. And in different societies, the way we can touch, I always say, may I touch you here? May I show you this? Even on the face, never mind anywhere else. And that's fine asking with the may I. But I think what I'm getting at it, Andy, because you are 21 years closer to them than I am, is how do we communicate certain things, whether it's the physical act of singing or the development of character or kiss and touch on the stage, when number one, the appropriateness of that kiss and touch has changed through the decades, but also there's less, what's the word I want? Not illicit, because I don't want to judge sexuality at all. That's not my thing here. But that there was a certain free zone of naughtiness. Let's say to have the Octavian and the Marshal and two women in a bed together, one of them playing a young man who then goes and plays a young woman playing a young man. All that was very Freudian Viennese. It was terrific. But right now, that could be interpreted in an entirely other way, not negative way, but without the naughtiness, without the sense of illicit of doing something out of the norm, because quote the norm now is much more fluid, which is great. But if the fluidity is great, how do we communicate to them what Don Giovanni does, what Leporello does, the way Donna Elvira reacts to what they do, the way Donna Anna, who has a very strong sexual component, you can hear it in her music, but it's a different kind of sexual component. I find that when I want to talk to them about these things in a way that helps them build their characters, I really have to measure every single word, number one, so I'm not accused of being inappropriate, but number two, without touching anyone. But just, it's a whole challenge now teaching and communicating the physicality of singing, number one, but number two, more what I do, the interpretation of roles and the exploration of the values when our modern times have fostered or evolved other values that I think in most ways are better. A couple of ways, maybe not, but in most ways, certainly better. Um, that's a big question I asked, but I wanted to give you parameters so that you can talk about, because you're right in the action now, working with young people, and I met your students, and I understood that even among them, there were very different value systems from one to the next to the next. And therefore, you may need to understand that with one soprano, your approach to her is very different from another soprano doing the same music.
Well, let's see. You had said something a while back about how a lot of teaching is physical. And in case anyone didn't think so, singing is an athletic event and it involves your whole body. And therefore, you need to address what you do and how you feel with every part of your body. Now, a lot of that can be done about just imitating motion, squat like I'm squatting, curl your toes into the floor. I don't need to touch you. I can do that over a Zoom lesson, which incidentally we're doing for 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there will be times where if there's a student, usually a female student, who I know I don't need to, I want them to get in touch with their low breath support. Because we are such a collegial atmosphere, I can just go next door and say to my soprano colleague, happens to be Jennifer Bird, can you work on her breath support for a minute? Can you show her, your low breathing, check hers? And it's all, I mean, we share students that way, and we're a village. I think I
Mm-hmm.
briefly talked with you about how
Yep.
we're like that. So I can accomplish that way. But to your question about addressing sort of the changing attitudes towards sort of gender and sexuality on the stage. I mean, I don't do any stage directing. So most of what I do is just talking to one soloist and their attitude and so forth. But it's that same approach. You ask yourself the question, and if something hits a nerve at all, you just simply answer the question for yourself, and you don't tell anybody. I mean, it's that same I think it's that same tool to answer a maybe a slightly different question.
But um, you teach singing. I more often teach role interpretation development. And I find myself on thorny territory. I'm not touching anybody, but I'm touching them emotionally. And sometimes you need to do the work to bring stuff out. But at the same time, and I began our conversation talking about you and Joyce DiDonato and the way you incarnate roles and characters in text. And Lorraine Hunt Lieberson, who we'll talk about, was another one
Who's
that
my
way.
favorite singer, I think I
I
told
know
you.
she is, and so we'll
Yes.
talk about her after. But all those people had deep, deep connection to what every character was experiencing, whether it was Lorraine or now Joyce as Dido in the Berlioz Les Troyens. But with young people, especially, I don't ever want to make them feel uncomfortable, but sometimes you have to go to an uncomfortable place. So very specifically, I think the hardest opera to stage and direct, and I've said this elsewhere, is Don Giovanni, because all the issues in the opera, which are to me global, universal human issues and not unique to the characters on the stage. But Don Elvira can be a comic figure, she can be a tragic figure. If I'm working with a soprano or a high mezzo who is singing Elvira, I don't need to ask her about her love life. And frankly, if she's 25, who knows how much love life she's had? And I don't want to give her trauma for life in the act of learning Don Elvira. But to really make Don Elvira work on the stage, you kind of have to go there. Otherwise, you don't feel it. So I'll name two singers I admire: Barbara Friedel and Carol Vaness, and Kiri Takano as well, but in a very different way. Wonderful Don Elviras, but specifically Friedel and Vaness, because they, in their own way, channeled who Elvira is, and if they drew on their own lives, we don't have to ask them that question. But nonetheless, they were so vivid on the stage in those roles. Whereas I've seen many Elviras just fade into the woodwork, and I can't criticize them. It's an incredibly hard role because she is a source of ridicule to the other characters, but nonetheless feels very deeply what she does. Anna's issues are different. Zerlina's issues are more about class than sexuality. Leporello, it's about class and sexuality. The Don, it's about a very other kind of fatalism, where sexuality, I don't even think is central to who he is. I think that his issues are otherwise, and he expresses it by how successful he is at making another romantic conquest. I will call it romantic, another sexual conquest. And that's just one opera. But we can go to any number of operas. I'll pick one out of my head, Don Pasquale, which is an opera that on the surface seems very romantic and light and so on. There is so much cruelty in that opera. I have trouble with that opera. The music is great. I love Donizetti, but the characters are so cruel to one another in what is a comedy that I feel more squeamish in Don Pasquale than I do in Don Giovanni.
Mm. Mm.
And I really do. I just feel they're treating each person is so dishonest and treating each other so badly that I can't quite root or feel for. I feel sorry for the old
Mm.
man
Mm.
in a
Mm.
way,
Mm. Mm.
because he's just being abused when all he wants is some affection. And it's a tough work. But what I'm saying is, the more global point is, we need to work with our students on all the issues in the operas, and they're not pleasant,
Yeah.
but they're life. I mean, Carmen, just any
Mm.
number of Carmen is, a global character, but she's not a happy character. And how
Yeah.
do you teach a woman in her 30s to go there
Well,
and be able to do the music? That's your side.
Right.
is the most important thing. Prima la musica, poi le parole. First the music. Music. I mean, I say this from the theatrical side. I'm the first to say the music comes first, not the theater.
Well,
So
if you're talking
how,
about opera, yes.
yeah, how in this is a big question, but how in your working life and your approach to your music, because I know your heart, do you go there with students to unlock this stuff, even if you say you don't have to tell me? Because just a final point, when they wrote their essays for me, they were very honest and very candid because they knew that I would never share it or take it further. But that degree of honesty I found very important if ever I were to work with any of them on any role, because they did, most of them, there were two who did acknowledge what they feel and who they are, which I thought was very important and not necessarily what singers of 50 years ago would have done.
I had one student who didn't quite finish her voice degree and had a number of issues, internal and external. It was a combination of, her own anxiety and or depression, but also sort of the treatment she was getting from her classmates and the community. And I don't know where one ended and one began, because we're a very supportive and collegial community. But if you don't feel that support, you don't feel that support. And she stopped by my office after she had dropped out and had come back into town to pick up some things and so forth. And she just came into my office for a minute and said, "This is the one place on campus I'm happy to go to." So I must have done something to make that room uh, a place where, over a series of interactions, you feel sort of safe and have permission to say what it is that you need to say.
Mhm.
So whatever it was that I did, I think listening and being sincere at all times, I value those. Um, you may know I used to have a quote of the week on my board, and I would publish it for all to see. And sometime last year, I stopped changing that quote. I didn't run out of quotes. I have a few more, but I just kept the one that is, the most important thing is that we listen to each other. And the source of that was both of my children's kindergarten teachers.
Hmm.
They, they had to take home handouts, and they're very good at their elementary school, the same elementary school I went to in Massachusetts. They're very good about having that folder that was for handouts. You bring them home, have your parents read them, sign them if necessary. And on the first day, what comes home with this handout, and it's got a little cartoon drawing of a teacher. It's talking to a class, and it says the most important thing is that we listen to each other. And boy, have we lost that
Mhm.
in our political discourse and socially through a myriad of causes. But one thing I can say for sure is that the student knows that I'm listening, not just by the look on my face or when I can, respond that I've understood what I said, but also my follow through. If they ask me to do something, I do it. Or if I say I'm going to do something, I do that. So that's a long term, let's say one semester's worth or more of interactions. Then, for most individuals, then you're to a point where you can broach
Mhm.
more sensitive topics. And when necessary, one of my resolutions this year was to not talk about myself so much. So this interview is not helping with that at all. But seriously, there will be times where I can relate an experience that it does not purport to be the same as theirs, but just to say, I think I understand, and I'm gonna share this vulnerable experience with you, just to say that I think I understand, and I hope you understand that I understand.
Mhm.
Then you can pretty much talk about anything, and they do it on their terms.
Yeah.
Being a voice teacher, it always has been, but more so in the last few years, you're part therapist. Now, you're not licensed therapist at all, and you
Mhm.
do not purport to be, but you end up being that. And step one is listening, and then in your response in both your words and actions. But yeah, then if you're that person, you can talk about anything, and in on the student's terms. If they want to relate an exact experience, they can just tell you about it. It's just you. They sit on the couch, I'm at the piano bench. Yeah, I think that modality of talking has worked. You don't have that same thing in an opera production, but at the same time, there's different situations. There's the opera director who, I mean, our head of opera, Dr. Lee Holman, is a great. You're one part director and one part acting teacher,
Mhm.
and I've worked with so many. I was fortunate to have so many figures all throughout my development. Um, and there, you don't have the benefit of the history,
Yeah.
but you can, in your demeanor, in your asking the particular questions, and you're asking of those questions, you can assess just how, what topics is the student slash singer
Mhm.
comfortable broaching. um, and if everyone is on board, if everyone in the cast is willing to, either in a table read or in a discussion or in an acting exercise, approach difficult topics, they'll do it. And I actually, in that way, I think students are very, open to that. They've decided to come to a place to learn, and any decent student follows the basic assumption that they don't know what it is they're going to learn, or they don't come in and say, I already know what it is you're going to teach me. And so they're open to whatever it is. And then there's the trust.
Mhm.
I think any, decent conductor, director at any level has got the artist's trust.
I want to point out for listeners, because we are speaking in the early part of 2022, that Andy is also very much a working artist as a performer. But because of the pandemic, so many of you have not been performing as much as we would want you to. Uh, some of you, your age group and a little older, have become wonderful teachers. You were a teacher before, so it's not because of the pandemic. You were already in Boulder, but certain colleagues of yours have taken teaching positions or have become artistic advisors to companies such as Cincinnati and Los Angeles and Atlanta, and there are others, but those are three that come to mind. And but eventually all of you will be outperforming again. So we were talking about the way you teach and the way you convey things to other people. How have you changed as an artist in the 2+ years of not doing what you do so well? I will say that. Um, it's funny, Andy, when you say something flattering to a redhead, you can't even tell if he's blushing because the color's the same.
It's already, I
But no,
am.
I think listeners know it's not just our friendship, but that I really professionally understand you to be a very fine artist. And therefore, what is it like when you, in effect, are not doing what you are trained to do?
After a period of a few months of having zero motivation to practice, and in case that wasn't clear, you have to practice every day or 6 days a week to be in the shape to give your best performances. I decided, oh, this is a great time to get back to the fundamentals. And so I didn't learn any new repertoire for a time. And what I did, this is a perfect chance for me to mention Bel Canto Boot Camp. Go ahead and look that up. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the creator of that program, Rochelle Jonk, is someone you might want to talk to
Yep.
someday. But I not only followed the program, but was taken on as a mentor in that program, and I've been ever since. So I went back to some very, very basic techniques, something I didn't have the time or the patience to do. Probably should have been doing it, but it was the perfect opportunity. And when I see basic, I mean the Mathilde Marchesi method book, which she wrote several, but her main book, The Theoretical and Practical Method of Teaching, starts on page 1. Sing one note. Now, if you're for those of you who aren't singers, just trust me when I say that is terrifying to do in a room where you know no one is listening. If you've made money and got critical acclaim and recognition for singing many, many notes on different syllables and words and so forth, going back and expecting to sing one decent note if you haven't done that is terrifying. And so you have to make a mental shift. I'm going to quote Frederica von Stade, I'm going to breathe in and accept the voice that comes. And so it builds from there, and then followed another method book, the Niccolo Vaccai method book, and I swear by that now. My gosh, can I sing? I could go into detail of that, but suffice it to say, I got back to the basics. Then the time away from the audience made me so much more grateful for that, but also reminded me that I had not, I think, sufficiently and completely and thoroughly, methodically addressed performance psychology. How it works for many singers, especially younger ones, say under 40 or so, is if you just do more performances, you do more auditions. And I still audition, by the way, but just by doing them, you get more conditioned to it. And yes, that is true, and you must do that. But there are certain approaches that you must take, certain thoughts you must have while you're practicing and while you're preparing to get in front of an audience. And I had never, and it wasn't because I wasn't told to. I know for one, I want to give credit to as many teachers as I can in this hour, but the teacher I had most recently, Penelope Beatsas in Boston, did say from time to time, you should address your nerves and your performance anxiety, and I didn't do it sufficiently, and I got by in most cases. But I've since done that through various methodical approaches. Most notably, there's a book called Golf Isn't a Game of Perfect. I'm blanking on the author's Rotella, Bob Rotella. Yeah. I happen to know how to play golf, but you do not have to know a thing about golf to get the parallels. But following the book and doing everything it said really helped. But then easing back into the performance world, I've been easing back into it, performing in a couple places where I knew, how do I put this? No one was listening who had power over my career. There wasn't a reviewer from the New York Times. There wasn't a casting director listening. It was just audience, and knowing, as to my knowledge, that there wasn't anyone important in that way helped me ease back into it. But being grateful for the audiences, I mean, come on, you're without that one thing you need to do, and then you have it. That definitely renewed that. But I don't remember exactly what your question was, but it was
how you've lived the pandemic, and this show was born with the pandemic. Thomas Hampson, you ever heard of him?
I have.
Thomas Hampson was my first guest, April 24th of 2020. Good friend, the way you're a good friend. And it was born of the fact that my musical friends and other friends were locked away. And then many people who I didn't know that well, who I always wanted to talk to, and I brought them into the picture. But this was my version of that I wanted to grow and learn and share ideas, but also learn from people like you, and put ideas out into the world for the post-pandemic or for the evolving pandemic situation. And a lot of the things I asked you today, I've never asked people before about the whole environmental issues and talk about the pods, but they're very important. But there are at least a couple of more things I want to get to with you, Andy. One is you mentioned before that one of your earlier performances was work of the 21st century in when the century was 4 or 5 years old. One of the hallmarks of your career is you are one of the go-to artists for living composers and librettists. And it's because I'm sure they recognize in you your intelligence and good voice and flexibility. But what else? I can think of a couple of other people who are go-to for living um, composers. How does that happen? And did you seek it? Did they seek you? A bit of both?
It's really quite easy. I want to say two things really quickly. One, to say that I've heard of Thomas Hampson is an understatement, and I've been admiring his work and studying his work too.
Yeah.
I think I may have mentioned in terms of environmental activism, you're not going to meet someone more serious about it than Gabriella Frank, who is a living composer, so relevant to your question. But I mean, she does not travel by air anymore.
Mm-hmm.
She's very serious about it, and I think she could spread the good word to your listeners on how to be more responsible there. But we talked about how the Marilyn Horne Foundation one arranged many opportunities for me to talk to audiences and give my song program to audiences, both in these informances where I go to community and talk to
Mm-hmm.
schools and then give a professional performance where the school students were invited, but then performances at Carnegie Hall, and I'm very grateful for that. And it was at Carnegie Hall. It was every January. I think this would be coming up. Then I don't know what they're planning for this year, but
Well,
it's
now
some.
it's called Song Studio, and it's run by Renee Fleming. Marilyn stopped it about 2 or 3 years ago. Renee took over,
Okay.
and it went from being the Song Continues, which was Marilyn's version, to the Song Studio, and um, it was in the middle of January and concluded with a recital. I forget it, 23rd of January, something like that. So recently. And but yes, it continues, but in a different version, more on Renee Fleming's philosophy of teaching. But yes, when you were there as a young artist, it involved performances at Carnegie Hall and working with the wonderful educational infrastructure that is Carnegie Hall, in addition to the musical and historical.
Mm.
Carnegie Hall is a wonderful, and full disclosure, I've taught there, I've spoken there, wonderful place for musical education and a huge outreach to cities, to students. Joyce DiDonato and Eric Owens have done things for them in prisons in New York to bring music to the prison. They've created something called the Lullaby Project, where homeless women or women with children in disadvantaged situations write and create lullabies and have lullabies as part of their interaction with their children. And all that is Carnegie Hall. So yes, you had the great
Right.
advantage. And
So
yeah,
the mid January, which comes around Miss Horne's birthday, that
January
event is still going
16th.
on. It's wonderful to hear that is still going on. So they commissioned some songs by Gabriella Frank that I was to premiere at that January 2007 event. So the Horn Foundation's connected me with some composers, but otherwise it is quite, no matter who you are, it's pretty easy to connect with a composer. The interaction goes something like this. You write to them and say, I would like to sing some of your works. How about that? And they say, yes. I mean, they're very hungry to have their works performed. Just think about you. If you're the singer, you're very hungry to get a singing engagement. If you're a composer, you're very hungry to have your works performed. So it's simply a matter of deciding to do it. And these days too, it's not even hard to look up their contact information. Every composer has their works on a website. You can hear samples of it. Sometimes they'll have sample PDFs, the first couple of pages with a watermark. You can look
Mhm.
at that music and then order it. And ordering the PDFs at a very low cost is very easy. But what's ever since about that time, maybe a little before, composers have just been sending me music. And I give it all a look, when I can.
Mhm.
And I will say much of it, some of it goes into a pile where like this isn't for me for whatever reason. A small amount of it, I should say. Uh, Most of it goes into a pile. I really like this. I need to program this somewhere. And then mostly by luck, a small amount of it goes into this is going to fit my upcoming X program, and I'm going to do this. So you should know that. I try to respond and say I've looked at it, I really love it, and I'll keep it in mind and pass it on to another artist who I think could do it. And usually composers are good about transposing, moving the key up or down so it fits a different voice. And that's one of the things I want to get better at is matching singers to repertoire.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm lucky to be around some people who are masters of that, and I want to get. I need to be good at that since I have to assign repertoire to all voice
Yeah.
types. But how do you build relationship with composer? It's you just decide to. I mean, there are a few composers who are too busy for you, or too famous for you, or too important for you, and you might. But there are plenty others who will be very happy to hear your stuff. I'll mention a database called Song Helix, all
Mhm.
one word. That's the go-to place to look up any song. Well, I should say it's a growing database, so I encourage you to use it to look up songs by any parameter imaginable, the composer's background, the poetic themes, um, so on and so on and so
Mhm.
forth. But also, I'm going to invite you. It welcomes contributions. So if you know of a song that's on there, you can add it to it. If you are a composer, you put your own songs in there. Grow the database so everyone can know.
And I'm going to ask you a question. As you very well know, sometimes when you're performing, there's a person who's reading the newspaper, unwrapping candies, and so on. We know that I'm doing this from my room in my home. Someone is doing some kind of work above me. Do you hear it? Have you been
No,
hearing?
but
Okay, good.
no, but do you hear some kind of noise coming from my end?
I don't, but and
Good.
my engineer in Berlin says we don't. I just mentioned that because obviously I hear you and I'm following what you're saying, but it is the equivalent of two people talking in the front row while you're singing.
Oh dear. Well, I especially appreciate your attention then
For the
in that
past
case.
hour, and I've been thinking, does it? I haven't seen it register on your face. Anyway, I have decided that Jake Hagee is going to write Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and that you will be
Oh
Brick,
yes.
and
Okay.
that if we want a mezzo, Isabel Leonard, if we want a soprano, Lizette Oropesa, will be Maggie, and but you're definitely Brick. It's a great role for you. I don't know if you know the play that well, but then there's Big Mom and Big Daddy, and those are wonderful parts. We'll have to find the right person to do it. All right, Suzanne Mentor for Big Mama, I think would be wonderful. Or if Dolores Zajic wants to do it, would be wonderful. And Big Daddy has to be a tall person. He has to be taller than you. So Thomas Hampson could certainly do it if we want that, or if we want a bass. Um, it I'm colorblind, so Morris Robinson would be a fantastic. I think he's taller than you are, and
Yes.
he has. I think Big Daddy has to be a bass, and it helps to be from the South as he is, and so therefore, okay, that's the next opera, and we'll do casting call in about 2 years. Maybe Jake will let me write the libretto, but I think it's perfect actually. So
Oh, wonderful.
if you agree. The next thing is, Andy, as you know, and as my listeners know, I asked my guests to provide a few selections from the Adagio catalog. You gave ones that are really wonderful. They're not uncommon, but they're absolutely right for you, for the Andrew Garland that I know. And so I'm going to go through all five, because interestingly, three of them are artists and two of them are works of music. Benjamin Britten's War Requiem, an extraordinary work, premiered at the Coventry Cathedral, I believe, in 1961 when it was destroyed. And there was one German artist, one British artist, and one Russian artist. And the version that you picked does not necessarily follow that. No, they're all English speakers. But the baritone in it is Benjamin Luxon. Now, I greatly admire Benjamin Luxon. I only worked with him once very briefly in Boston, but I don't really know him. But why Benjamin Luxon?
I'll be completely candid. This was the CD that I checked out of the library and then dubbed onto tape and listened to while I was working outside by myself. I mean, this was I was in high school and didn't didn't know very much about anything. I hadn't decided to be a singer yet at that point. I was a participant in high school choir, and singing was just an enjoyable extracurricular activity. So it's just what they had in the public library. So I have since, so there's my first association, and I'll always have that association with that version. But since, having learned that there are other recordings and other soloists available, I go back and listen to Luxon's singing, and I guess my fondness of him was solidified when I watched the Robert Shaw Preparing a Masterpiece series. I forget who produced it, but it's a video documentary of him preparing a master work from beginning to end. And there are 7 or 8 of them, but this one is particularly well edited.
Mm-hmm.
And you get conversations of Mr. Luxon and hearing him warm up a little bit. So the combination of first sort of the roundness and richness of his tone with the clear diction, and those are hard to pull off, those two things. They're not opposed to each other, and yet they take some work to pull off simultaneously. But also just hearing what he had to say about the work, about the great sort of suffering and rebuilding that was, that created the necessity of this work, that just spoke right to why we do this, why we sing at all for audiences.
Yeah. Luxon, when I described you at the beginning as having in your DNA, but also your visual presentation and your use of English, a strong affinity for Song of the British Isles and Ireland, Luxon has that too. And his presentation of language was very much like the way you showed us before about rubato and legato. He stopped singing because he suffered profound hearing loss. And that was a loss for all of us. He didn't retire at a very old age because his hearing began to decline. But I invite listeners to go find the performances of Benjamin Luxon, especially in English, because I would never say that you imitate or copy anyone else, but you can see the line there. And that's why I thought that's why you have the Benjamin Luxon performance, the War Requiem. If memory serves, and I would have to confirm this, but if memory serves, when it premiered in 1961-62, Benjamin Britten conducted it, and the tenor role was sung by his partner, Peter Pears, the tenor. The baritone role was sung by Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, and the soprano was Galina Vishnevskaya, or the Russian. And that sort of set the template for the British, the German, and the Russian, in other words, 3 of the combatants in World War II. And one of the artists that you listed, not surprisingly, but completely understandably, is Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau. I've covered him a lot on my show, but tell us your Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau feeling.
For as many years and as many different recordings of him that I've heard, as many repetitions, I have trouble articulating why it is this. This is not a cop out, but I'll say, you know, talking about music is like dancing about architecture. You know, how do I put into words the fulfillment I get? I guess I relate to him on a couple of levels. I think, you know what it was, is early on, after I just discovered him and started listening to him, one a voice teacher who wasn't my voice teacher, but he was a voice teacher living in Amherst, where I went to school. And incidentally, there's a 5-college system there, where the 5 colleges within a short bus ride of each other, you can take classes at the other places. And so therefore you get to know the teachers, you know, all the voice teachers, not just the ones on your campus. So anyways, it was one of these teachers, Rod Giesek was his name. And incidentally, he had studied with Orrin Brown, and I got to take a couple of lessons with Orrin Brown before he passed away. So I'm feeling very fortunate there to be at the right place at the right time. But anyways, Rod Giesek, the gentleman who had seen Fischer-Dieskau live, I never got the opportunity to, but he said 2 things. And as soon as I heard these things, I said, I want to be able to do this. One was when he started a song, let's say it was a very high energy song right from the get-go. So like Anschwager Kronos, or to the Schubert's song to the Coachman Kronos. That not fast, but picks up with a lot of energy right away. And to signal the start of that, I think ideally the singer does something to start the piece. It is not a musical note; it is a gesture that signals the piece is started. And this gentleman who was relating the story said he almost fell out of his seat when he saw it. He said, I want to be able to do that to an audience. The other thing, and it's sort of vain and self-indulgent in a way, but I mean, don't you want your audience to have an experience? And if it's not, and I think it was Martin Katz, the coach and a longtime collaborator of Marilyn Horne, who taught a class, has said, if it's not going to be extraordinary, why do it?
Mm-hmm.
So try to live up to that. The other effect, the other memory that this gentleman related to me was Fischer-Dieskau just finished a song, don't know what song it was. Maybe it was Schumann's Stille Tränen, Silent Tears. And he said after the song was over, he could see the whole song still hanging in the air. So there was something that he did to make that whole experience have a flow, keep your attention at every second, and make you remember it. You know, that's the one thing about performing arts, is unlike visual arts, it's you do it and then it's gone.
Mm-hmm.
But you want the audience to go away humming a tune, but remembering a feeling. Mm-hmm. And so I said, I have to do that. I have to do that. I have to do whatever it takes to get to that point. And so I try to do that every time.
I knew him when I was a kid, and I've told that at another one of my programs, so I'm not going to retell it now, but you and I over Colorado beer or California wine will discuss that. But the other baritone you picked, and really wonderful, and unfortunately I think a bit forgotten because he died too young, was Donald Graham, who I knew, I worked with 1927 to 1983, and I worked with him at the very end of his life on a production at the Met of Arabella, in which he played the father of Arabella. And I don't think he knew that he was going to die soon thereafter, so you didn't get the feeling of an exhausted person at the end, but someone who was fully vibrant in his career. And created such a complete portrayal of this role. And Mignon Dunn played the mother, and Kira Takano was Arabella, and Kathleen Battle was Stenka. So it was an amazing cast. Bernd Weichel was a wonderful Mandrika. And so he was such a good, detailed actor, and he could do comedy. He performed a lot with Beverly Sills in the famous Don Pasquale that I spoke of before, where they're all horrible to one another. And he sang with Marilyn Horne and Pilar Loringar and Joan Sutherland and people who were, at the very, very top at that time in the 80s and before. And they all wanted him. They all asked for Donald Graham as the baritone who would appear with them because he was a great actor, great singer, solid, good colleague, but frankly was not intimidated in the presence of Joan Sutherland and Marilyn Horne. And they treated him as a colleague and they loved him, but they also, he fed them, is the way I would put it. And when you watched him and Mignon Dunn, a great pro, working with Kira Takano, a wonderful Arabella, but had a huge burden in that very tough role, the young Kathleen Battle, it was a lot. And I think that when the Met did their casting, they were smart to cast Donald Graham and Mignon Dunn as the parents to provide the solidity there that was much needed so that the other artists could really shine. So why did you pick Donald Graham? I imagine you didn't know him or meet him or
No,
anything. Yeah.
it was first I had a consultation with Matthew Epstein, who's a very influential manager. And I was at least one of your guests, Catherine Malfitano, I think, mentioned that it was her manager. But he gave really good insider advice, and it was after I graduated school. I'm kind of embarrassed I hadn't heard of Donald Graham in all of the sort of exploring of recordings that I had done. But anyways, he said, you should listen to this voice. You have this certain quality of intimacy in the way you sing. And so I went right away and listened to Donald Graham and said, yes, there's that combination of, not to be too simple, but technique and artistry, which, by the way, are not separable from each other.
Right.
But, you can sing in a way that where each one of your notes is perfectly lined up as it should be. You can sing in a way where you're genuine, you're feeling what you're saying, and you're expressive with your text and taking risks and so forth. But you've got to be doing both of those at the same time. And very few people do that for me consistently. And he's one of them.
One day I think you'd be wonderful as the father in Arabella.
Noted.
Yeah. He has two daughters, and they are different girls. They all have their not competing interests. They love each other as sisters, but they're just very different girls. And the mother frets, but the father's, he's solid. He's a good father. So
I'm already prepared.
Yep.
That's my situation.
And then Rachmaninoff Concerto for Piano number 3, you picked a recording with the Philadelphia Orchestra, number
2.
2, of course.
Yeah.
It was your selection number 3. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Concerto for Piano and Orchestra number 2 in C minor, opus 18. Eugene Ormandy, Philadelphia Orchestra, Arthur Rubinstein piano. A year ago, I had John Rubinstein, the son of Arthur, on this show, and we spoke about his career, but also about Arthur Rubinstein, which was a thrill to do. Why this piece of music and why this recording?
Again, it started out because it was what I had access to. My father had a pretty good vinyl collection that he had amassed. There's a story of someone with a great ear and a great music appreciation who probably could have been more of a practicing musician, but a teacher early on told him that he couldn't sing, and that idea got stuck in his mind. Which is it's a shame. Fortunately, that doesn't happen so much in education anymore. But anyways, he still is a great appreciator of music, and this was just one thing in his vinyl collection. And so fortunately back then there weren't as many distractions, Netflix and internet and so forth. uh, so I would just pop that on, listen to it, marvel at it. We'd talk with him. He remembered listening to it in college
Mhm.
when he first purchased the record. uh, so what struck me first was the sheer virtuosity, just being amazed, not to cheapen it, but when you're impressed at, say, a gymnast or an athlete or a circus act, someone doing something, you can't believe that it's humanly possible. But then on further listenings, became aware of, oh, has this composer sounds like Rachmaninoff. When I hear something else by Rachmaninoff, I can tell it's Rachmaninoff. It has a deeply Russian quality to it, but it's different from Tchaikovsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, Mussorgsky, Prokofiev. It's different from all of those.
Mhm.
Both the rhythmic figures that he used and the particular harmony voicings and harmonic changes are Russian, but then uniquely his. And I did, for better or for worse, my piano teacher, who was another very important figure in my development, he did assign me a couple of Rachmaninoff preludes that probably shouldn't have been assigned, but I did manage to play them.
Mhm.
I don't know. So then I had that appreciation both of listening, but then being able to play a small slice of what this composer wrote, all before I had any sort of thoughts of being a practicing musician.
And then finally, you listed another artist, Lorraine Hunt Lieberson, who the gesture you just did, James Levine used to do whenever her name was mentioned. He would give a fist pump
Well, rightly so.
because the degree to which he admired her work. Very briefly, mezzo soprano, who sang both Baroque and contemporary music. She did some of the 19th century repertoire, especially a magnificent Dido and Les Troyennes, but also leader singer. You listed specifically something I got to hear her do. Bach Cantata number 82, Ich habe genug, I've had enough. She was someone who battled cancer for much of her life and died at the age of 52. And I think, I don't want to be certain, but that was directed by Peter Sellers,
Correct.
Sellars, who is a wonderful director and artist in his own right, librettist. And they had a very particular deep artistic understanding. She was from San Francisco, but a lot of her work was done in Boston. So you being from near Boston, I think, did you have any contact with her?
No, unfortunately, I never met her, never got to hear her live, but I have many 1 degrees of separations of relationship with her, most notably Stephen Blyer.
Mm-hmm.
And you
Talk
can
about Steve. Steve is a fantastic guy. Talk about Steve.
Okay, where to start? I had mentioned that half of my recital career is directly attributed to the Marilyn Horne Foundation, and the other half is the New York Festival of Song.
NYFOS. People should look it up.
Yeah, I often refer to as NYFOS. That's what
Yeah.
they're talking about. Who is better at programming, that is, selecting songs in an order for singers and then talking about those songs? He is the guru that I always go to for song selection and how to talk about a song in a way that you want to hear it, and your ear is guided through that song very gently, even if the material is difficult. Their motto, you know what the NYFOS motto is? No song is safe from us. So in other words, just because it was a popular early Beatles song doesn't mean that a classical singer and pianist can't do that. And in fact, the last program I did with them was Schubert and the Beatles.
Wow.
And at first listening, some people say why, but if you think about it, I think it was Ned Rorem, or I think he said that the Schubert was the Beatles of his time, or vice versa. Prolific, hit after hit after hit, and remains in the canon forever.
So Die Winterreise, and she's got a ticket to ride.
Well, yeah. So here are some of the actual pairings
Yeah.
that we did, and this was the setup was quite clever. We had and the other things, the programs go through many drafts, and I made sure to save those drafts as a document. When you see a program there, that's not on day one. We just didn't decide 2 months ago these are the songs we're going to do. Many revisions, but we thought we would do all the Schubert songs intermission or pause, and then all the Beatles songs and with their respective order. This first song here in the first half corresponds, but early on we said no. So we'd pair them together, but on the printed program are listed only the Schubert songs,
Mm-hmm.
and the Beatles songs were announced from the stage. In fact, they weren't announced, and the reason for that was we are all very familiar with the original chordings that the original artists did. And if we hear that song title, we're going to have that expectation in our ear. And I think hearing, an operatic voice and piano, also violin and guitar, by the way. Charles Yang is someone you might want to talk to, much younger than me, but very rich in ideas and abilities and thinking. But anyways, so he played rock and roll violin on there, quite an addition. But so some of the pairings, Im Walde, in the woods, or
Norwegian Wood.
Exactly. But but Stephen did not need to mention the title of the song, and in setting An Schwager Kronos, to the coachman Kronos, and taxman, death and taxes. There you go. And they're both in D minor in the original key. So what we had there, if you go to an IFO show, there's one Stephen on stage right, and then another pianist on stage left. So you could do what we call attacca, that is, the two songs are attached. So the end of this song is still playing, and this one begins. There's some of your pairings.
So there. I want you to work on a program now of Wagner and the Rolling Stones.
Okay.
It'll work.
It can be done. It can be done.
But I do want to get back to Lorraine Hunt Lieberson because she merits discussion, because, she died 15, 16 years ago, and sadly, she's erased memory for a lot of people. And she was an extraordinary artist, actor, singer, everything. And your favorite singer. Talk about it.
Well, in the most fundamental terms, again, she has that combination of technique and artistry that I find so rare, that she comes from here's a good way of putting it. A colleague of ours, Stephen Tharp, who is with a very encyclopedic knowledge of historical recordings, but I think he actually did perform with her once. But what he said and he hosts a weekly show of historical recordings, and when he played her example of something, he said, when you listen to it, you hear a beating heart in there. And it stood out among. I think he played the same Handel aria by 3 different people, and this one was so much more human. But at the same time, I mean, a very fine-tuned instrument. Again, like with Donald Graham, someone very knowledgeable recommended her. I had read a lot of reviews of her performing and said, okay, I've got to listen to this. And then the sound of, sometimes too, the way someone expresses words, it grabs your attention. You have to hear what they're going to say next. But also, just the sheer tone quality of their voice. You may not even know what word they're going to sing yet. It's just the first ah sound. But that grabbed me. So you have the word and the tone getting me at the same time. And then, yes, you could say that about a lot of, say, singers of mostly romantic operatic singing, but the the complexity, the different layers on which you can listen to this thing, the risks that she takes, the unique way of saying one word that you don't hear anyone else do. I said, one, I've got to listen to this, but also I've got to do this. I know I can with my instrument and my abilities. I can do this, and I have to.
So, Andy, we could talk for hours. There are just a couple more things I want to address. One of them I hinted at the beginning, the other one I haven't brought up yet. I think that listeners getting to know you in this conversation have a very strong feeling about who you are. And I'm just going to add something to that. One of the things I've always admired about you, though I've never said it to you, is your dedication to public service. And whether it's going on bike rides to raise money for cancer research and care and so on, you are what Joseph Polisi, the former president of Juilliard, described as an artist as citizen. Marilyn Horne is that. Joyce DiDonato is that. Eric Owens is that. Tom Hampson is certainly that. There are certain people who are that, and you are one of those. Is this something you learned? Is it something you set out to do? How did that become part of your total
That,
persona?
I think, started first with my parents, who did a lot of volunteering through our church. I grew up in a Unitarian church, and there the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee was something I just did it because everyone else was doing it. I didn't. It wasn't like a chore. It was something we're all doing together. And then about that same time, I had started the Boy Scouts, and in order to rise up the ranks, you have to do a lot of service projects and help your fellow scouts complete their service projects. So the motivation was, the advancement, getting to Eagle Scout, which I did. There's that's an incentive, but you hopefully, which I did, you learned, the reward is the knowing you've made the world a better place, and the status and the benefits of the rank. Yes, there's that. That's maybe the motivation, but then hopefully you do learn that it's it's the service, it's the helping itself. Another thing I learned through the Scouts is that you do almost as much work, sometimes more, showing that you did the work. And that, I remember the Scouts invited me to give a speech once, and I remember that was one of the most important things I learned that directly translated to my career. The amount of time and effort I put into showing people that I can sing equals the time that I spend singing.
Yep.
For those of you looking to build your careers, that's how it is.
And finally, Andy, and I thank you, I want to go back to the beginning of our conversation, our Adriatic and Aegean trip, where we were working with these wonderful young artists. You were one of the 6 young artists. The pianists were a little older than the singers. That's why I'm separating you. But all of you have become outstanding artists. And I have followed the careers of all of you. And what I remember very, very well as very young people, you were all very fully formed and developed as people. And part of the trip, one of the best things was going to these ancient theaters and churches and spaces and forests, cypress forest, whatever. And I took Sasha Cook to a place where she sang over a Greek temple. And I took photographs of her and the sound of her and the acoustics of the Greek temple. I seem to remember with you, we were in Ephesus and you were wearing this Boston Red Sox baseball cap for some reason. And, and you were singing in this ancient space. Talk about some of the memories off the ship as a musician, very specific. I don't mean as a tourist or whatever.
Oh, sure. I'll just throw in really quick, just throwing really quickly about service too. As a full-time faculty member, a full 20% of your evaluation is on your service. So
Uh,
it's research, teaching, and service. So that's the incentive there.
but you had that well before you became a professor.
Right. It's not something I'm doing just for my job. Yeah.
Right.
But we do require and value that. Yeah, singing at the amphitheater at Ephesus. Oh my goodness. You look at it and you say, there's no back here. How could this possibly have an acoustic? You open your mouth and you get an echo that's almost like the one that you get in Hill Auditorium. That's the Ann Arbor, Michigan acoustic. They knew what they were doing. Wow. And to think, when you think maybe 1,000 seats in that amphitheater, easily. When they put on a play, a spoken play there, now you can see how the words could be heard and understood without amplification. So that was, just the sheer impressiveness of the acoustic there. We gave, I think, a total of 9 concerts on those 9 days. Each one of us got a day off here, but it was a lot of programs. And it was such a joy to share those with the audience. And again, that's why I do this. I love sharing this music, new and old, with audiences. But we did some programs that were based on Greek themes, and so being at the origin of their, that source material was a nice connection. So thank you for that.
Sure. So Andrew Garland, in our virtual times, there's a reality about you even across the ether of the internet and Zoom, and you in Colorado, me in New York. I'm very happy that our conversation enabled people to get to know the person I know. You know that I think very, very highly of you, apart from the baseball incomprehension. But in every other way, I really think you do wonderful work, and I'm honored to count you as a friend. And I want more people to discover you when we can go out and perform again beyond the means that we are. I mean, yes, there have been some performances in 2021, but Omicron and variants and so on. Omicron is not the Greek word that we wanted to learn when we were at Rhodes, but keep on keeping on. I loved what you said about how you revisited your work and your artistry during the pandemic. I think that's an example. You're an example. And that's all I have to say today, pal, but it was wonderful to see you, and I thank you.
Well, as they say, right back at you.
Yep. And take care. And I know in a better place. It sounds like Elizabeth and Don Carlo at the end of the opera, but in a better place, we'll see each other at a certain time.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, thanks,
Thank
Andy.
you, sir.